next speaker is Brann, and he's going to be talking about weeds. Greg has a private consulting practice, synergistic grazing management. He provides land management planning to farmers, ranchers, land preservation organizations, and public land managers. Greg has had the privilege of watching more than 200,000 acres be transformed by his attentive planning. I know Greg very well, probably 35 years. Used to be the NRCS state grazing specialist for Tennessee here. Very, very knowledgeable. And I literally look forward to the pasture walk tomorrow because I know he plays a big role in that, in identifying weeds and kind of talking about the benefits of the weeds and, you know, why we don't spray those weeds, okay? So at this time, Greg, thank you for coming.
All right. Thank y'all. Well, this year was a perfect storm for weeds. We had, in my area, we had a June that was, I believe it was no rain in June. And then July was 11 inches at my farm. And the warm seasons just exploded. Bermuda showed up where I hadn't seen it in a long time. And Johnson grass went nuts along with other weeds. So we're going to look at the weeds from every direction. I like to, when I walk on the land, I don't like for it to be mown because I can't tell as much about it. But I can read the land, you know, tell you a lot about it, use indicator plants, different plants for saying what's going on with this land. So we'll move forward here. Do I point it at your computer? Here we go. All right, so here's something I pulled up, the rules of succession. And I agree with the first part of this for sure. I better get away from the speaker, and I walk, so I better get out of the way. So, all right, a species will move into an environment when conditions are suitable for its establishment. I definitely see that. And will it move out when conditions are unsuitable for its reproduction? Maybe. Perennial weeds, they're going to be there. We're going to have to work with them. We're going to have to do a little work on them. So, but annuals, you definitely can manage them out of your system. I have no doubt that we can get rid of them. Here's an overview of what I plan to cover. Plant-animal interaction. You know, how can we use animals to turn those weeds into forbs? What's the value of the weeds quality-wise? And to use as medicinal pasture, whatever. Indicator plants telling us, is it infertile? Is it compacted? What's going on? What's the past history? And then, you know, what are some different definitions of weed? Weed ID, some book, maybe just one book, but there's several books you could go to for weed ID. Weed prevention, what can we do to keep them from coming back? And then weed management. I'm not going to talk about herbicides. If you're interested in herbicides, UT has a great book on weed control, and it goes into great detail on herbicide management. A weed has trouble growing in grass like that. The best weed control is good grass. All right, so I like to do the plant inventory before I say what, you know, people ask me all the time, how many cows, how many sheep, how many goats, that kind of thing. Well, it depends. If you have all briars, we need a lot of goats. We probably don't need so many cattle. Or if you get some cattle, it might need to be a special breed, and we'll get to that. Sheep. You know, forbs, they're more herbaceous plants. Forbs and grass, they're kind of like little cattle. I'd never say that about a goat. And Jim had that joke about the sheep, and I'm with him. And then cattle, one of the great things about cattle is if the grass is this tall, or even corn, I've grazed corn, cattle don't mind walking right in there. They're not a prey animal like goats and sheep. All right, and then you may need to adjust your stocking rate or your proportion of these species over time. Goats are the one that's the worst or the best, at eating itself out of a food source. It'll remove things like briars. They're pretty easy control with goats because they don't regrow like as fast as grass. So we can take those buds off. You know, it's about removing carbohydrates, just the opposite. We just manage them opposite of what we would for good grass management. Yeah, think about growing something instead of killing something. I think that's been mentioned earlier today. Just showing some Johnson grass and other grasses mixed together there. And Johnson grass, you know, it's definitely a weed to crop farmers. It's one of the first things they'll go to as far as grazing. However, we still need to put some management in it. I don't want to shade out other desirable plants, and Johnson grass can shade out fescue, orchard grass. Orchard grass is more tolerant of shading than fescue, so it'd be a little later to come out of the stand. But anyway, we need to manage and keep light to desirable plants. That's my thing I'm thinking about. Just a few pictures of grazing this was with goats, been grazed with cattle for years and years, and then introduced goats at a low stocking rate, only 600 pounds per acre. So they had selectivity, and that's an after picture. So they just annihilated it. Now, and that was briars and buckbrush. And then you see that burdock down there, the big leaf plant by that limb laying there. And they didn't eat it. But I've noticed that burdock, they'll eat it when it starts making seed. They'll strip all the leaves. I think there's something like terpenes or something protecting the leaves, and then they move to the seed and protect the seed. All right, and then here's now these briars are too tall. You want to keep whatever you're grazing, like I like to keep the briars at the nose height of the animal I'm grazing, so that'd be goats. So I'd want them no taller than this. But in this one we turned in like this. That's Electronet, and this stocking rate, I believe is listed here, is 1,700 pounds per acre, and you still see there's grass. If you want to win some money, bet somebody, you know, that they're going to eat a briar before grass, and goats you're going to win every time. They're not going to eat grass as long as they have a briar. And they'll stay on that, and they'll just keep hacking it and bringing it down. There they are, heads high on goats, heads low on sheep. We'll see another slide that shows that right here. And those are sheep. I drew that black line in there, and the sheep are in the background. This is some grazing corn. The cattle are over in the corn. The sheep are back cleaning up. They kind of segregate themselves. They'll stay in their species groups and move around the field. And here's the goats up front. You can see that one right in the camera there, right in the front, is eating spiny amaranth. Great thing about having good grass is those weeds are reaching for light. They're more succulent. They're more palatable. And so they're going to eat them better. They're going to be higher quality because they're tender. I raised some pigs too, and this is the main point of this slide is to show breaking them to hot wire. And do this with every species. If you're using hot wire, when you introduce them to the farm, take them to a lot, the corral usually, and expose them to 10,000 volts if possible for about 2 or 3 days. And then you can start your rotation. Otherwise, you know, even though somebody says, yeah, they've been around hot wire, well, was it on, or, you know, who knows? So just break them to hot wire. That's some annual ryegrass. This was just sown after the pigs were in there last time. On seeding, just throwing seed out there, I like for it to look like it's tilled up, like it's fresh. If it looks like this floor and it's slick, the seed's not going to take. One way that might help is this time of year, some leaves drop on top of that and sort of sandwich it and make it seed soil contact. It might work. So that's annual ryegrass. I like, as far as throwing seed out there, the one I like the best is annual ryegrass because it's a great seeder and it's a reseeder. So it's easy to get a stand of. Crabgrass is the other one I go to. So cool season, annual ryegrass, warm season crabgrass. And you can throw all kinds of other things in there, but those are the bases. And Again, grass is the best weed controls. So if you didn't seed that, a lot of other plants would come in there, maybe undesirable. Speaking of undesirables, here's some that I think are undesirable. Now they have some qualities we'll look at in a minute, but stickweed, wing stem, they're real similar. One has yellow flower, one has a white flower. Nimblewheel is a terrible grass, and even though I've advocated and I like sheep being a component, just because you add sheep to a cattle farm doesn't mean all weeds are going to disappear, because they're more selective. They can bypass this nimblewheel better than cattle can because of their mouth. They can just go right around whatever they want to go around. All right, and then you've got the bitter sneezeweed, compaction, right? That's the first thing that comes to my mind. The joint head grass, don't see that a lot, but I have been on a few farms where it's really taken over fields. All right. So what's the value of the weeds? Bare ground's the worst thing. So we're lucky in this part of the world that something's going to grow. You give it a minute, here comes something growing. So it's soil cover. They are in, I don't know why I put this, oh, well, you could just use the imbalance of weeds. It's telling you something. But also, and I think it was mentioned earlier, like briars are high in phosphorus. So they're bringing phosphorus back to the surface. They can get by with less fertility. Typically, they're not the root cause of the problem. People think, well, I'll spray them and I'll be done with this problem. But it's usually something else causing that weed to be there, like the low fertility. I've already mentioned you giving back. They're varied root structures. Alan talked about the soil health and the root exudates and all this. So they've got that. Diversity of growth, cover different times a year. Animals consume some of them. So it also dilutes the effect of tall fescue, just like clover does, if they consume it. Here's some plants with tannins, and if you have sheep and goats, that's more important than it is with cattle. And I'm not saying plant these things, but if you have them, you might use them. Some of them you'd want to plant, like annual aspidisa, arrowleaf clover, berseem. Those all can work. Chicory can work, but a lot of the others you might not want to plant. And I believe it was Alan showed these earlier, just showing that there is quality in weeds if they consume them. Again, the more tender it is, typically the better they'll consume these different weeds. Red root pigweed, lamb's quarter, ragweed, and yellow foxtail and barnyard grass. They're all real similar to alfalfa. Again, with cattle, they don't eat ragweed unless it's like 12 inches or less. When it gets bigger than that, they're not going to eat it very well. Sheep are going to be drawn to it. Goats are going to be drawn to it. We were looking at a picture of some smartweed earlier. It's not so great in the quality regime. It's only 51 on the TDN or IVDM. All right. Like I said, vegetatives higher quality than flower, and then the fruit stage it even gets lower quality. Indicator plants. Let me first talk about the picture in the upper right there. I used to spray fence rows, and that fence row was sprayed a year earlier, and look what came in, buttercup. I don't have buttercup on that fence. I don't spray anymore, so I don't see buttercup there now. At the other end of the pasture, where it comes to a point that's near a corral, that's where the animals come together and there's water source there, so it's compacted. Buttercup's an indicator of compaction or wetness, and they're real similar because they're low oxygen soils. So, you see sedges, that's a sign of wetness, but or compaction. Goosegrass, I used to think that was a weed, but animals love it. It's very palatable. If you ever have army worms, scout your goosegrass. That's what they go to first. All right. Then looking at low fertility. This picture here on the right is, that's red sorrel. And then see those daisies. And then if you see rabbit tobacco, I know it's low fertility. I can't tell you exactly what's off, but as far as production, it's off. It's not going to produce a high yield. As far as diversity, it's pretty dang cool. I love the look of that right there. Now, how could we deal with this without doing fertilizer or extreme tight management of pastures and all? We could plant something that's already adapted to that fertility, and that'd be something like a big blue stem, the native grasses. And the great thing about a site like that is there's no competition. You knock that back and you plant in it, you're not going to have any weed competition. Those things aren't very competitive. We can knock them back. And Todd, you did that, didn't you? Sweet vernal grass, bad weed on the plateau area. If you ever drive by or you see somebody cutting hay and you smell it, it's just got a sweet smell, and you might think, well, that smells neat or cool or whatever. When you learn what it is, it doesn't smell so good. Animals don't like it. Now, let me back up and say, though, as you can get them to eat these things with high-density, short-duration grazing, and once they get used to it and adapted to it, they'll consume some of them. They're still not fabulous. Here's a bad one, cocklebur. Velcro was invented based on that cocklebur. ARS figured it out. But see that big leaf? That's your worst weed because it's shading desirable grass. The burrs bother me, but that big leaf bothers me worse than anything. It's shading desirable plants, and it's going to shade out whatever's underneath. If you have wool sheep, that's a real number one problem, or alpacas, that is a number one problem. You want to pull it up, get it out of the field. And if you just have a few of them, I still recommend doing that. If you've got them everywhere, it's kind of ridiculous to even start that. Yeah, so what is a weed? It's competing for space, nutrients, moisture, and sunlight. Number one is sunlight, because if it's getting sunlight, it's getting all those other things. So just look at sunlight. It's a plant out of place. Let's say Roundup resistant corn, and it's growing in a soybean field. It's a weed, right? And they have trouble getting rid of that. They have to switch around and use something besides Roundup. So poisonous plants, in general, the animal's going to avoid them. They're not that big a problem, but that canopy leaf, like perilla mint, the most dangerous weed, most poisonous weed in the East, animals usually won't consume it. They can be allelopathic. That's maybe overblown, but something like buckhorn plantain. I see patches of it. If it's laying flat and it's just nothing else growing there, it's taken over the biology in that area and won't let something else grow. All right. We'll get to control of these in a little bit. So, is it a weed or a forb? Here's the common ragweed. It's a wonderful plant for sheep and goats. It's, like I say, it's equal to alfalfa. Okay, let's say you want to just raise cattle. You don't want to raise sheep and goats. Some of these breeds, Corriente, Florida Crackers, Piney Woods, these are breeds that will consume these. They're browsers. They graze too. They're also very low cost. If you really want to, if you're more about spending less money, buy some bred Corrientes or some Corriente heifers, breed them to a South Pole bull. You're up in value real quick. So and you've got browsers. So it's pretty cool way to go. Sheep, I like the Katahdin breed, St. Croix. They could be Barbados, Black Belly Barbados. Those are all breeds that are browsers and grazers. Kiko goats are my favorite, but the Spanish meat goats work real well too. There's more differences within breeds than there is between breeds usually, so just select good animals and somebody that manages like you're planning to manage or you are managing. Again, high density, short duration grazing can overcome a lot of these things. We can do it like Russ is doing it just with cattle by a tight rotation, rotating multiple times a day. He didn't see many what I'd call weeds on his place. This is my place here, and what's missing a lot of times is the cover. And I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit here. But like spiny amaranth, bad weed for some people. Feed rings and all that. We know a lot about the amaranths because it's one of the herbicide-resistant weeds. Not spiny isn't, but Palmer amaranth is. And they've done a lot of research, and they know that hot, dry, exposed soil is where it germinates. So you've got to have cover. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself maybe a little, but I want to talk about this, is that in the end, whenever something's germinating, that's when you need cover. And you need to get your canopy above it. So cocklebur is going to come up about May 1. We need to go ahead and have something there May 1. That means you may have to have something in April. You see what I mean? Because here comes May 1, I don't have cover. Well, what am I going to do now? So be ready. Perilla mint, it's a bad weed on my farm. Same thing, it shows up in late April. It's germinating. I can see it underneath there. Nimblewheel, I can see it underneath the grass, but as long as I keep a canopy of grass over it, I'm going to be okay, even though a nimblewheel is a perennial. So, yeah, management or landscaping, for landscaping or production. Landscaping is where we make them do things. And if you're not moving them fast, like Russ was tightening them up and he's moving on before they cause damage, but if you're making them do a job and you're not leaving much behind, that's problematic for the soil and weeds. It's fun to do, though, I'll tell you that. You can really clean up some stuff and make some things happen. Leader follower, it's easier said than done, is because there's a rule in grazing management is don't graze a field over 3 or 4 days. Russ mentioned, even quicker. So that means both groups need to move within 4 days. So you got to keep them tight. So every 2 days at least, you need to be moving those groups. The lower demand animal goes first. The high demand animal comes first. The low demand after as a cleanup. And you can do it with different species too. To weaken a plant, we want to get rid of that carbohydrate production, whether it's with grazing or with a mower. We're trying to lower its stored carbohydrates, especially with perennials. Already mentioned that. All right. Okay, this is a book I like real well. So I showed it to some folks a while back, and they told me, well, that book's $100. So I don't know. But Ozzie Obey out of North Carolina now. She's in Virginia, I think. But that identification adaptation is good. It's not just weeds. It's forages as well. Another one is Weeds of the South. That's a good book. NRCS has the Weeds of the South book, and you could look it up there. You could take pictures of weeds. These days they have all the apps too. Whenever I first saw those apps come out, I thought, oh no, I'm out of a job, because I know weeds pretty well. So, all right, so is it a broadleaf? Is it a grass? Grass-like would be like rush or sedge. Is it woody? What is it? Legume is a forb too. Is it an annual? A biennial would be like a musk thistle. It's a 2-year plant. Or is it a perennial? Perennials they're here every year. They just keep coming back from the roots. There's a lot of annuals that are reseeding annuals, and that can get confusing. There's also different ecotypes of plants. Like perilla mint usually grows in the shade, but on some farms it'll grow out in full sun. I just wanted to show our garden, for weed control. We did solarization on some of it, and then we did what some people call lasagna grazing. We just lay down cardboard and then mulch on top. It's a no-till garden. It was grass. It was just like the grass in the foreground there to begin with. And you pull a few weeds. It's real easy for my wife to pull the weeds in that garden. So, but it is. It's real easy, and you just keep adding mulch. 6 inches of mulch is a nice target in a garden. In the grass field, I'd like to have a 1/4 inch of mulch. All right, strategic times to control annuals. Germination, 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 but throughout the growing season, if they're up, we need to get a canopy over the top of them. Early seed production. One thing, and we can think about pollinators, if they're fixing to bloom, go ahead and let the bloom be there for a little while, and then mow before late bloom, right? And actually, with thistle, I've seen real good control of thistle mowing in late bloom stage, because it's going to die. That's at the end of its biennial stage. It's done what it's going to do. It doesn't have enough energy to start again. So that's a great time to mow on thistle. Kind of risky, because if it's turned to the plume stage, you're just populating the farm. All right, reduce soil disturbance. Soil disturbance gets things started. This is a pigweed here. Know your germinating weeds. If you have a problem, ID those germinating weeds, because that's when you really need to be on your toes and take care of them. I didn't realize I had vegetative plants in here so many times. Perennials. Again, they're the problem. As soon as they leaf out, if you're going to mow or graze them, they'll consume it better at grazing, but also mow it. And then mow throughout the growing season. I think the next slide shows it, but the chemical companies, have compared their herbicide treatment to mowing. And, well, I'll just go on and go to it. Mow late summer too, but yeah, so the cost difference is about $75 to $100 for mowing if you have to mow 5 times. And it's about $15 to $35 if you spray. But regenerative folks, I think, I'm willing to pay the extra money. I don't want to be around those herbicides or chemicals, so it's just something we do. But that 5 mowings is a hot lot to deal with. And I hate to mow that. You mow after grazing typically is the way to do it, but it takes less fuel because you've already removed everything they wanted to eat, and it sets it back to a vegetative state. Now, I'm probably not going to be mowing 5 times a year. So we just learn to live with these plants. And again, they add to the system in that for pollinators and all the cover and everything else. Just try not to let them shade out your desirables. These loppers, I love them. These are Felco 21s. I probably get more joy out of using these things than anything I've got. The Felco number 2 is the little hand pruner. This is a Felco 21. They're expensive, and I maintain all my fence lines pretty much with a 0 turn. 0 turn's the most dangerous piece of equipment on the farm. They can get away from you and cause issues. So if you're new to hill land, go slow. And don't go off a hill, go up a hill. Get a 5-foot deck, and that way you can get underneath. You learn to really dodge in and out. About every couple of years, you need to get the Felco 21s out and clean up the multiflora rows right next to the post. Other things that could be used, of course, weed eaters. Even if they run good, they're hard for me to start. I just don't like running a weed eater. I don't like the noise or anything else about them. The extension agent here, Milton Orr, he mentioned he fertilizes his fence rows. Now, how counterintuitive is that? So that they'll consume the fence row better. They'll eat under it better. Pretty cool idea. Feeding on the fence row. The cleanest place on the farm as far as field is the fence row, because the animals don't defecate it. That's why I see broom sedge next to my fence rows, because I didn't get the mineral cycling there. I didn't get the urine and the dung. So feed down that fence row. I'm talking about baled hay, square bale hay. Just flake it out, feed right down the fence. Works real good. Biological control. We know that can go wrong with things like starlings and Japanese beetles, all kinds of issues. There's a few success stories, like this is a musk thistle, and those are weevils in there. They're eating the seed. And they've done a heck of a job. Back in the 70s, the Nashville Basin, the Murfreesboro, Nashville, it was going to be taken over by musk thistle. And now there's very few. And it's due to this weevil. And you can collect them. If you see a seed head that just didn't quite develop, it bloomed, like, that's not a great example there, but it just bloomed, but it didn't go to full expression. It's probably got weevils in it. You can look on the back side of that seed head and you'll see some little eggs laid there. Anyway, and then that's rose rosette down there that's killing multiflora rose. It's a virus that's spread by thrips. So what else can we do? We can stomp these weeds. We can pull them. Whenever I had just a few cockaburras, I'd see one, I'd stop the truck, pull it up, and haul it off, because I know what those things can do. Chopping, there's all kinds of tools out there. Chaining. Anybody heard of chaining? I know Jim has. In the West, they do this. It's not a friendly practice, but you run two tractors. You probably know better than I do. You run two tractors, and you've got a chain tied between them. And that goes across the pasture just doing this, and you get under those multiflora rows and just pull them out of the ground. They do it for cedar and different things. Where are y'all from? North Dakota? Okay, yeah. Okay. Well, it's a cool idea, but like I say, it's not very friendly to wildlife, you can imagine. And then burning. We got to be cautious with that, be a prescribed burn. Of course, there's herbicides. Tillage, the organic people use tillage real heavy. Soil health-wise, it's a real negative. It's hard to build organic matter if you do any tillage. Even a drill is somewhat negative. So we just got to take all this into... And then Kathy Voth has her videos or training on teaching cows to eat weeds. She feeds something different for several days and then starts feeding weeds and then turns them out in the pasture. You can check that out. Yeah, the stomping. Every time I place a mineral feeder, I'm looking for a weedy spot. Sometimes I can't find one, that's rare, but sometimes I can't find one and I think I'm getting there. But feed it on buckbrush, nimblewheel, anything that you don't like, that's the place for this mineral feeder. Mobile water is another thing. It's to have your water that's plumbed and all that, and it's dependable water, but have a water trough and just set it on some weeds. You talk about some impact. You can bring it with cattle with water. You can get them to go to different areas. In the other regard on water, if you rest that water point, it's got so many nutrients and all there, you're going to grow the best grass you ever grew if you give it long recovery. Chicken tractor, we're using chicken tractors on nimblewheel. We'll place our chicken tractor on nimblewheel, leave it there until the nimblewheel's dead, gone, and then we'll reseed it and go to another nimblewheel place. All right, there's some mobile water. This is a buddy of mine. He was using a back rubber. I've tried some organic things with back rubbers. Even though vegetable oil mopped on a cow, it keeps flies off for about 10 days. Don't try it on a back rubber, it'll just stop it up. Mineral oil will work, diesel will work, not very regenerative, but it will work without the insecticide. So, but it's an attractant, that's the main reason I put that in there. So when should a field be reestablished? I think whenever it's over 50% undesirable. It's time to think about renovating, doing something new. First step, I don't even have it in here, is probably to add clovers. One way, and the animals are going to go in to get that clover, so they'll consume more of the other and possibly learn to eat it. check the nutrient balance, and even if you're not going to apply fertilizer, it tells you where you need nutrients. You need higher management by feeding hay or tightening up grazing, those kinds of things. We've already covered those others. Boom or bust. The great thing now, they're calling it total grazing. It's a dangerous technique, and it needs long recovery. But it's a way to get this plant material down and intact with the ground and get some nutrient cycling. And it's a great seed bed prep too. If you wanted to overseed that, you've got some seed soil exposed, you could get that seed soil contact. It's another fun technique, and it's great this time of year if you're gonna, let's say you're stockpiling grass. I'll do this technique on a weedy field, feed hay there, and stockpile the rest of the farm. So what would we do in the order of establishment? This is kind of ideal. You'd plant annuals for 1 or 2 seasons, and then we're going to also strive in, after we get that done, we're going to plant the perennials whenever, like it'd be the fall is the best time for grass, cool season grass. If it was a warm season, it'd probably be April or May we would establish that. And then let that establish well before you start grazing it. All right. Yeah, so we want to manage for that thick stand. This is something to just enhance grazing management. Something I did this last year and I couldn't help but share it with you. It's what I call a master link. And what it is, I guess that's a pointer. Yeah, right here. I've got lots of steep, rugged land, lots of drainage ways. So we just fence across there. It's not tied to anything. It's high tensile wire. There, let's see, there it goes off in the woods. And then when we connect, this is a permanent fence here, we can tie our temporary fence into this electric. Now this is hot. And you can divide up and keeps you from having to fence off that whole drainage way. It's a real cool technique for steep terrain or rugged terrain. We've put in about 5 of those. And those are, okay. In summary, be observant, that was mentioned earlier. Just be aware of what's going on and who's getting light and what's exposed and when these weeds germinate, those kinds of things. One more. I have a pasture walk every fall, at third Thursday in October. This year it's the 20th. And you can go on my website, gregbrann.com, and you'll see the flyer. And we request RSVP to know how much food to present. Yeah, so this is a corral area they're gathered around, and see that there's some weeds in there, like pigweed. This is the red one. Can't tell exactly what the other one is, probably a smartweed. This year it's all Bermuda. It's solid Bermuda and there's no weeds. What it was, this got exposed, this got some trampling and its soil exposed when those weeds germinate in May or June. And so they came on. This year, the Bermuda was so lush just due to the environmental conditions, and we didn't use the corral possibly at that time. And so it's good weed control. Mike, I believe that's it. If any questions? Yeah.
I noticed you talked about your back rubs there. Hornfly control is definitely a problem for us. I'd like to hear your thoughts or anybody else that's got any good suggestions on hornfly control.
Well, I feed garlic. I feed 1 pound of garlic or more for 50 pounds of mineral, and I get good control. And then I do mop on like we preg test the other day with a blood test, and we have some vegetable oil, the cheapest vegetable oil you can get, and we just mop it on an animal. Like bulls are worse than cows, must be the testosterone, and it'll give us about 10 days of control. And then sometimes, I don't do this regularly, but I'll cut a red cedar because cedar oil also has some fly control to it, and they rub on it and get a little bit of fly control. I was on a farm the other day, and you could see they were in a cedar grove, and they'd walk under those cedars, and those cattle that were staying close to the cedars didn't have as many flies as the other fly. Now, they would come to them soon after, but you can buy cedar oil and mix it with mineral oil or vegetable oil and put it on them. But garlic's the best thing I know of as far as regenerative type. Yeah, but flies were a problem this year. They've kind of really built up forces this year. And I can't stand it. I have to do something.
Any other questions?
Jim? I put him on the spot. Now he's going to get me this time.
This is a comment on chaining. And-
Change?
Yeah, chaining.
Chaining, oh.
Yeah, Greg looked back here and said, I would know what he meant. He said you put a chain between two tractors. He's not talking a log chain. What they use in our area for chaining are ship anchor chains.
Okay.
The
Big.
links are 2 feet long and weigh 250 pounds apiece.
Wow.
And they put them between two Caterpillar, D9s typically are that big, 100 foot of that, and they pull out brush with that
Yeah.
to create strips
Yeah.
for better elk habitat is the main reason
Oh,
they
wow.
do it. Yeah.
Oh, huh.
But it takes out mountain mahogany, sagebrush, greasewood, everything like that.
And everything else living there.
Right here, Greg.
Okay.
So I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on burning. I would like to burn my fields. What are the advantages to it and what are the disadvantages to it?
I'm not an expert in burning, but I'll tell you what little I know about it. Hopefully it's not dangerous. Is if it's woodies, you burn in the fall, like trees. Usually the most burning is done in February, March, and that's on grass, and that's to get rid of everything else that's in there. You've got to have some fuel, and the fuel is standing grass. If it's real short, it's not going to burn. So something else on burning is on the plateau. I was on a guy's place, and he had a bunch of bulrush around a lake, and he said it'll burn any time of year. And the animals will eat tender bulrush or rush, but they won't eat it when it's mature. It's got oils in it. Another thing on burning, this is small, but if dozer piles, I learned this from a dozer operator, is they're giving off oils soon after they are cut, and they'll burn better like a week after or 4 days after than they do later until they really dry out. So yeah, the burning, be cautious with it. I'm not a big advocate of burning, but native grasses is where most of the burning is done in the eastern U.S. And it's very beneficial to them. They respond. They were evolved with fire, so they have a good relationship with fire. Fire burns up carbon. We need to be growing more carbon than what we burn up, and that's the threat. And so it's a setback, but it might improve things to grow more biomass in the future. So that's the consideration. Burning broom sedge, broom sedge responds to fire. It's a native grass too, so it would increase it. Serratia lespedeza will increase with fire. Any of the like bicolor lespedeza, they go nuts after a fire. So be cautious with fire. Uh-oh.
I just thought maybe you might speak about feeding hay strategically in like nimble wheel patches and.
Yeah, and that's what
the
I've
mineral
done
feeder
is
or
feed
the
hay
hay.
on a nimble wheel pasture and knock it back, and then you could seed something. You don't have to seed something. It's a warm season plant. Some cool seasons will have the advantage once you've knocked it back, but typically I'll plant something after I've knocked it back. What Mike?
So the hay might have seed in it.
Oh yeah, the hay may have, if it's poor quality hay, it may have some seed in it. No, it likely does. Yeah.
Okay, one right over there.
Yes, sir. You insinuated that a seed drill might cause negative disturbance.
Just
What's your take on aeration or an aerator?
yeah, you don't want to aerate, and you definitely don't want to just go aerate. The key to aeration is roots and more biomass. My dad bought an aerator. They're a great renovation tool to go over it and then seed. And that's not all that negative, but I worked with a long-term organic farmer, and he had the panacea of rotation, grass-based, then crops, but he did tillage. And he never built his organic matter above 2%, even though he was striving so hard to build that organic matter. It's tillage is a hammer, so just try to produce more biomass than your negative. And tillage is it'll set you back a long way. Now a drill is not much impact. I'm just saying it's some. So let's get a stand if we're going to do it.
But even poking holes in thatch, you're just doing regular aeration, not tillage.
Yeah, that aerator is not as bad as, say, an airway aerator. You're talking about the lawn type one. Yeah, it's just poking holes, bringing them out. Yeah, that wouldn't be quite as bad, but still, the way to get at the compaction is more root mass, and that's good management. So,
Any other question? Right there's one, okay.
Hey, Alan had said this morning, or talked about diversity in the pastures as a benefit. Is there a rule of thumb? I mean, you mentioned, reestablish a pasture when it's more than 50% weeds, but where's the balance point between having diversity of species and having too much?
yeah,
and
for
trying to
me,
clear out?
it's, as far as unconsumable weeds, 20% is a tolerant level. Anything more than that, I'm going to take special strides to control them. But 20%, and I think that's pretty well accepted by weed scientists. That's when you need to really step up.
Thank you.
All right, one back here.
So, is it on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
I just recently learned that there's other sedges besides broom sedge. Could
Yeah,
you
and
speak
broom sedge isn't really a sedge, we just call it that.
Oh, really? Could you speak about the value of the sedges, or
Yeah,
others-
I
there's others?
I don't know real well the particular value, but sedges have edges is the saying. That's how you ID them. They have a three-sided stem. They're in about every pasture. Just about every pasture has path rush. They're a sign of low oxygen soil, which is compaction usually, not wetness. And again, we need those roots we don't want a lot of them, but they're not very competitive. As long as a weed, let's call sedge a weed, it's kind of intermediate. It's some value to it, because they do eat it when it's little and tender. You'll see it nub down to the ground in spring. But it's not shading anything. As long as it's not shading something, I'm not too concerned about it. Let's take ironweed. It's straight up. I'm not too concerned about it at first. But the problem is it's going to propagate. There's increasers and decreasers. And the increasers are the ones that are not grazed. And I used to think ironweed wouldn't be eaten by a grasshopper, but goats and sheep love it. Cattle, you could make them eat it. But it's not a problem at first, but it can be a problem. So I used to leave areas unmown, and now I'm questioning. I really study those plants that I'm leaving behind unmown. I don't like to mow a whole field, but if it's got perennial weeds in it, I'm going to mow it.
All right, any other questions? All right, great. Thank you very much.